Over the past few months, we have received a lot of messages reacting to our last few videos in our segment Buddhism Demystified. Of these, ones that stood out concerned the rise and emergence of Ambedkar's Buddhism. On 14th of October in 1956, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar denounced Hinduism and converted to Buddhism in a public rally in Diksha Bhumi in Nagpur. Dr. Ambedkar's clarion call during this public ceremony was in favor of kickstarting a fourth Buddhist school. Now we know that Buddhism broadly consists of three major philosophical schools: Hinayana, the so-called narrow or lesser vehicle; Mahayana, the so-called greater vehicle; Vajrayana, a major tantric subset of Mahayana known as the diamond vehicle; and of course Ambedkar's Navayāna, the new vehicle. Many consider Ambedkar's visionary reimagining of the Buddha's teachings as nothing short of exemplary and revolutionary. However, there have been criticisms by many which have slowed down the spread of his teachings. This brings us to the issue at hand. Is Ambedkar's Buddhism really authentic? Is there really scope to broaden horizons within the tightly knit world of Buddhist philosophy and spirituality, especially when it is replete with a heritage spanning over 2000 years? To understand Ambedkar's Navayāna, we must first understand the man and his contextual history. Before he became the apostle of liberation, freedom and equality among the Dalits and other downtrodden elements of Indian society, his life was a saga of suffering and sacrifice. Born to a poor Maha family, Babasaheb Ambedkar faced ostracization by way of untouchability from a very young age. Ambedkar broke new social ground very early in life by being the first untouchable to enroll at Elphinstone High School in Bombay. As a prolific scholar in the fields of law and justice, politics, economics, social reform, and even religious spirituality, he focused much of his life on the upliftment of the Dalits and other downtrodden castes. His sole aim was to eradicate the caste system. As a humanistic philosopher, his concern with the existential utility of any spiritual home ground for society was purely ethical and materialistic. Hence, the right conduct of man was paramount. Hindu casteist society and its dogma prescribed by scripture was not a suitable option for him. The metaphysics in dharmic literature was in opposition to his scientific worldview. After 20 years of deliberation involving flirtations with Christianity and even Islam, he decided Buddhism was the sole religion available to the untouchables. He called upon everyone to renounce Hinduism and to convert to Buddhism, but not before he engineered a political radicalization of the Buddhist philosophical doctrine. While Ambedkar believed in Buddhism's existential utility in ensuring the emancipation of the individual, Ambedkar's Navayāna hinged first on the emancipation of a certain set of group identities in society from the clutches of oppression. In Ambedkar's Buddhism, Gautama Buddha's original narrative calling for the liberation of the individual was subsumed by Ambedkar's personal narrative calling for the liberation of the excluded sections of society. Ambedkar's interpretation revised original Buddhist teachings to have been all about class struggle and social equality. Buddha's samsara was now Ambedkar's society. Buddha's doctrine of ignorance and desire being the source of all suffering was now replaced by that of class oppression being the source of all suffering. Buddha's calls for transformation were metaphysical, Ambedkar's materialistic. But is this really a problem? According to Ambedkar, the individual's salvation could be achieved only after the liberation from the oppression he faced as a member of an excluded group in society. One could very well argue that this new form of Buddhism might promote further sectarianism as opposed to its original libertarian intentions. But there is a more fundamental oversight here. Ambedkar rejected many central grounding principles of Buddhism. One of them was the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths. And Gautama Buddha's Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, that life is suffering including birth, disease, old age and death. The truth of the cause, that suffering is caused by desire and by ignorance which ultimately depend on each other. The truth of cessation, that suffering can be ended if its causes, desire and ignorance are removed. And finally, the truth of the way, that the way to end suffering is through the following of the Noble Eightfold Path, that are right knowledge or views, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right meditation. The Buddha also established a monastic order known as the Sangha with 5 ethical precepts: not to kill, not to steal, not to be unchaste, not to drink intoxicants, and not to lie. Apart from the 5 ethical precepts and the Noble Eightfold Path, Ambedkar rejected much of this. He regarded the 4 Noble Truths to be misguided interpolations to promote a monastic vision for Buddhism. This, in his opinion, was exclusionary. Also, in his interpretation, human suffering, the first noble truth, is not caused by the sufferer's ignorance and cravings. He believed that social exploitation, material poverty combined with the cruelty of others was to blame. In one of the most radical and revolutionary doctrines in human history, Babasaheb Ambedkar rejected the social nihilism and metaphysical ambiguity in Buddhism, and he put forward a brave new interpretation of the classical texts. According to Christopher Queen, Babasaheb Ambedkar replaced the original 4 Noble Truths with his own rendition. The first noble truth for the present age was the widespread suffering of injustice and poverty. The second truth was social, political, and cultural institutions of oppression, the collective expressions of greed, hatred, and delusion. The third truth was expressed by the European ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And finally, the fourth truth was the threefold path of Ambedkar's famous slogan, educate, agitate, organize. Ambedkar shifted the fulcrum of Buddhism's liberation theology away from the individual's spiritual victimhood to a societal one littered with bias and discrimination. Thus, his interpretation is decidedly modern, reflecting the materialistic zeitgeist full of social injustice and inequality. All this brings us to our critique of Ambedkar's Navayāna. We will first put forth our points of contention with his doctrine, followed by points arguing in favor of Ambedkar's Buddhism. Our 3 main points of contention are as follows. The first point is Ambedkar's interpretation of Buddha's teaching being all about class struggle and social equality. Ambedkar believed Gautama Buddha's teachings were motivated by the decline in society brought on by ritualistic Vedic religion and Brahmanism. And we partly agree with him. But social reform was not the driving force behind the rise of Buddhism at the time, because it has been well documented that Buddhism was an urban movement relegated to social elites. You see, early Buddhism's rise in the Gangetic Plains coincided with the transition from a subsistence economy to one of surplus thanks to agriculture. This urban economic revolution brought with it lucrative trade. The easy availability of metals, copper, and silver led to an increasing use of coinage. This further facilitated trade. All these helped create a new and powerful class of merchants and bankers. The society's structure transitioned from a tribal one to one based on economic class. Add in the baggage of the caste system and mix it with merchant trade, and you have the dominant classes being socio-economic in nature. It was only inevitable that the dominant socio-economic classes of the time also happened to be the chief patrons of early Buddhism. For example, Anathapindika was the chief male patron of Gautama Buddha. He was also the wealthiest merchant in the region of Savatthi at the time. But he wasn't the only one. There was also a chief female patron known as Vishaka. The fact that Gautama Buddha relied upon the ancient equivalent of the Marxist bourgeoisie for the spread of his Sangha is often overlooked. When we dived into Ambedkar's writings, we found 2 main instances where he interprets passages from Buddhist literature signifying the need for class struggle. The first one is his reference to Buddha's conversation with Ananda in the Mahanidana Sutta. The reason for condemning craving or greed is because many a bad and wicked state of things arises. Blows and wounds, strife, contradiction and retorts, quarreling, slander and lies. After calling this out, Ambedkar remarks in his treatise that this is the correct analysis of class struggle. There can be no doubt. Yes, this could be an analysis of class struggle by way of inductive reasoning. But it cannot be the only interpretation or conclusion to be extrapolated from that passage. especially without the explicit mention of the upper classes responsible for subjugation of weaker sections in society. Greed, craving, avarice are all fundamental human sins. They can have multiple manifestations in the social sphere. The second instance Ambedkar references for his interpretation of class struggle is a quotation from a dialogue between the Buddha and King Pasenadi of Koshala. Moreover, there is always strife going on between kings, between nobles, between Brahmins, between householders, between mother and son, between son and father, between brother and sister, between sister and brother, between companion and companion. Although these are the words of Pasenadi, the Buddha did not deny that they formed a true picture of society. As to the Buddha's own attitude towards class conflict, his doctrine of Ashtanga Marga recognizes that class conflict exists and that it is the class conflict which is the cause of misery. Ambedkar's insistence on Buddha stressing on class conflict being the only cause of concern is weak. One can argue that it is a symptomatic assertion, especially when the latter half of the quotation bears mention of conflict involving deep interpersonal relations like mother and son, brother and sister, and so on. Even the first half mentioning caste and class can just as well be interpreted as intra-conflicts in nature and still hold water. They need not refer to inter-conflicts. Interpretation in favor of interclass or intercaste conflict gets murky here. It has been documented that the Buddha did visit impoverished villages of the Chandalas, Damras and the Patalas among the other lower castes of his time. And yes, he treated everyone as equal, irrespective of their caste, creed or even class. He preached his way of enlightenment to them. This was his prescription of upliftment in society. Nowhere is it explicitly mentioned that his prime objective was to incite class struggle and overthrow oppressive forces in society. The Buddha focused on the diseased and disabled as well to rid them of their worldly suffering through his philosophy. Fixating on class oppression as the only dimension to Buddhist philosophy is thus limiting. The second point of contention is a sense of self as retained in Ambedkar's Buddhism. Sectarian liberation calls for the affirmation and adherence to identity. Thus, Ambedkar's Buddhism is at loggerheads with Buddha's Anatta or Anatman doctrine, also called the no-self doctrine. Anatta's no-self doctrine rejects the very existence of identity in any way. As a part of this philosophy, Gautama Buddha himself never identified with any varna or clan or sect after his renunciation. When there is no self, there is no I, and there can never be a we. Social games of universal equality, revolution and liberation involve us and them, and the self and the other. But Ambedkar believed that the concept of anatta in Buddhism was too pessimistic and esoteric. Thus, finding a place for the trademark Buddhist line of skepticism in Ambedkar's Navayāna is challenging. Which brings us to the last point of contention, the dynamics of individual versus group liberation. Buddhism's core teachings belong to the Shramana order, which includes Jainism, Charvaka and Ajivika philosophies among others. Shramana thought advocates the rejection of rituals and society and demands for the individual's renunciation from worldly order. According to the Buddha, all change starts with the individual. Reform, revolution and rebellion starts in one's inner world before the outer world can change. Hence, the individual's salvation is spiritual and metaphysical first. All three vehicles, Hinayana, Mahayana and Vajrayana broadly work along these principles. In fact, Ambedkar himself believed in this. Passages in his essay Buddha or Karl Marx clearly state this as well. But the interpretation of his Navayāna doctrine has it the other way around. Suffering in the world can only be ended by the overthrowing of oppression in society. Such a revolution would call for a collective effort, not an individual one. Thus, the individual's salvation by liberation is dependent on circumstances beyond the individual's personal span of control. It is existentially materialistic. This can set a dangerous precedent along the lines of Marxist socialism, communism, and toxic versions of the social justice wave. It is then evident that Navayāna's core motif is worldly affirmation, whereas canonical Buddhism's core motif is that of worldly renunciation. as is characteristic of the Shramana tradition. Thus, Navayāna and canonical Buddhism have opposite orientations. Since Navayāna operates on such a radical paradigm separate from canonical Buddhism, it is tough to reconcile the two. Having said that, one must be objective while critiquing Ambedkar's groundbreaking work. To look upon Buddhism's 2000-year-old history as purely orthodox is misgiven. Buddhism is as heterodox as they come. Even Vajrayana's Buddhism's rise challenged the cultural notions of its time. By syncretizing core Mahayana concepts with tantric elements and local shamanistic religions in Tibet and beyond, one can argue that the diamond vehicle is a far cry from traditional Buddhist thought. But Vajrayana is mainstream now, just like Zen Buddhism in China and the Nichiren school in Japan. To the naysayers who call Ambedkar's Navayāna a socio-politically radicalized doctrine, we might ask them to refer to the ancient Pali canon with works like the Digha Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, and the Majjhima Nikaya. These works delve into the question of common social ethics that also form the crux of Ambedkar's interpretation. In some form or the other, they also relegate the origin of suffering and its removal to the socio-political sphere. And Nagarjuna, one of the greatest proponents of Buddhism in the subcontinent, himself subjected the Four Noble Truths to critical examination and scrutiny. It was a part of his Madhyamika philosophy. So can one then really hold Ambedkar accountable for treason against Buddhism? It is common for one Buddhist school to regard certain Buddhist doctrines as core, only to be rejected by another school. Just look at the historical strife between the Yellow Hat sect and the Red Hat sects in Tibet and China. Analogously, Indian philosophical traditions have been known to innovate and evolve through commentaries and reinterpretations since time immemorial. What Ambedkar has done is remarkable. In many ways, one can argue that he wanted to leave behind a legacy similar to another legendary statesman from the past in Thomas Jefferson. Just like people credit Thomas Jefferson as the principal author of the American Declaration of Independence, people credit Ambedkar as the architect of the Indian Constitution. And just like Jefferson's monumental revision of the Christian doctrine, Ambedkar's Navayāna is also a point of inflection for engaged Buddhism. And just like Jefferson rallied against international slavery, Ambedkar has also given a voice to the downtrodden. His writings have sparked an underrated movement in Indian society. While there is still a long way to go, his followers are annihilating the caste system with each passing decade. So then who is to truly say Ambedkar's Buddhism has it all wrong? By arguing for one over the other, are we not losing out ourselves? Ultimately, you will have to decide. As Baba Sahib Ambedkar loved to quote from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Apo Deepo Bhava. Be your own light. So too may you shine on and guide the rest. Peace.